Welcome to Architects for Change, the podcast that bridges the gap between architecture, the built environment, and politics. I'm Jay Morton, your host. I'm an architect and political geek, and together we'll hear from the change makers and thought leaders who are shaping the future of our cities and spaces. Our conversations will tackle pressing questions that hold the key to our future. How can we achieve a net zero future? What does it truly take to design a better world? And most importantly, how can politics play a pivotal role in breaking down the barriers that hinder progress? Hi, welcome to Architects for Change. Today I'm joined by Just Build Homes, represented by Wyn Evans and Millie Dodd. And they'll be talking about their organisation, the work that they've been doing. And I think it's safe to say they're definitely much change makers trying to represent the voices of the unheard in the planning process. And we'll also be talking about a report that's coming out this week called 6,000 Reasons to Build. So welcome Wyn, welcome Millie. So maybe would you like to start by introducing yourself, introducing Just Build Homes, shared voices, and also what you're aiming to achieve and how you seek to shift the planning conversation.
Well, thank you very much, Jay, for inviting us on. So Shared Voice is a PR and comms agency. We work predominantly in the property and planning world, although not exclusively. And I think we are the only agency that engage supportive voices in the planning system. And we primarily do that through utilising far more robust opinion research methods than I think most of our competitors, and also looking at using digital engagement far more, because obviously most people get their news and information digitally these days. And when we set up Shared Voice about 5 years ago, we sort of posed the question, why is it that every opinion poll tells us the majority of people support house building in their area, but when it comes to planning consultations, the only people you hear from are objectors? And we looked at a lot of the opinion research that was out there. We undertook our own focus groups. We did a lot of message testing online. And we found that the people that were most supportive, according to all of our research, were younger people and renters. And we therefore wanted to develop a narrative that had resonance with those people. And we found it really, really difficult to develop a narrative that, from a developer perspective, that would reach and engage that audience. And that is why we effectively developed Just Build Homes as a purpose-built brand to engage and connect with that audience. And Just Build Homes now connects supporters of house building with the planning process. It gets supportive voices directly onto planning portals. And we've found a way of engaging that audience and bringing them into the conversation.
I mean, that's great. I mean, because I remember the thing about that particular demographic, particularly young people. I mean, I remember when I was doing work with Generation Rent back in the day, that it's the people who actually don't have a home and they're more likely, particularly renters, are more likely to move around. So they're actually really, really difficult to access and give them a voice. And it's really difficult to sort of generate campaign groups. So I suppose by targeting and using the digital methods that you're talking about, did you actually find it was easier to sort of bring those voices to the table? Did you actually still find they were actually quite difficult to target because they are more likely to move around and less in one place?
Yes, I think that's true. Although I think what you'll find both from the report that we're launching this week and also through the work that we do is we do find those people. So, a significant number of people that respond to planning consultations that we find will be people that are sofa surfing, that are in significant need. And it's a key part of the demographic that we are reaching.
So maybe let's just go back a little bit and hear a little bit more about the two of you, how you got to where you are now, what brought you into this line of work, and what really, really motivates you. So maybe let's start with Millie.
So I graduated university and ended up working at the Department for Work and Pensions as my first job. And I was working in 2 London boroughs with young people that had been involved in gang violence and been released from prison, to try and build opportunities with local businesses, find them jobs, help with benefits. But the one issue that I continually run into was housing. There were younger people who were being placed in homes with rival gang members, people who were being released from prison and put into temporary accommodation or sofa surfing. And there is absolutely no way that they could rebuild their lives without somewhere secure and safe to call home. And that is a problem that I absolutely could not solve from the role that I was doing. So I saw a job come up with Just Build Homes after doing that role for about a year, and I thought that that would be an opportunity to actually do something different and to bring a new voice to the conversation and do something to help the voices of people like the people I was working with actually be heard by decision makers, to show that there is a real need for housing.
And I suppose that's the thing, isn't it? I mean, I say this a lot, access to good quality, affordable homes. If everybody had that, we could actually solve a hell of a lot of social challenges and social issues. And I suppose with the work that you were actually doing there, Millie, you're really, really at the coalface and really understanding the extremes of what not having access to a good quality home and a sort of stable roots can be. And I think and also the importance of those people really, really having a voice. So I think I can see how you sort of got into where you are now. So maybe we move on to Wyn. Would you like to tell me about your background as well?
I did a planning course at university a very, very long time ago. And when I was at university, I got involved in politics. So I never became a planner. I got involved in politics. I became a political researcher. I worked at Westminster. I became a counsellor, and it is quite usual from doing that type of work that you move into sort of PR, public affairs, comms. And when I did that, the sort of sector that it was just natural really for me to move into was the sort of property and planning world. And in those days, back in the sort of late 90s, it was a much smaller sector than it is today. There were far less companies. There seems to be lots of companies now that work in that sort of PR lobbying in the property world. But I've effectively spent 25 years working in, I suppose, traditional property planning communications. And for the last 5 years, set up Just Build, just Shared Voice, bringing together people with more of a background in opinion research and digital engagement. And we've tried to sort of mesh those sort of different backgrounds together in what we're doing.
So I suppose the two of your backgrounds actually really, really do complement each other as well. So you've got the sort of communications element, but then also the sort of experience and exposure that Millie has had as well, that you can sort of bring to the table and really complement each other. And then the sort of two voices work quite well together in actually making this change.
Yeah, I do think that our strength is having so many different backgrounds. The fact that we base a lot of things on a genuine opinion research, and the digital element we bring, I think, is what is different about Shared Voice to other organisations.
I guess the big problem that you have sort of highlighted and sort of the reason for setting up the organisation, and actually the report that we're going to talk about, is the planning system is not working. And I think that what you've said so far, it seems that there's a key demographic that it definitely is not working for, and that is sort of the underrepresented, particularly young people. So where do you feel we have been going wrong, and why have young people maybe been less engaged, and how can we change that?
Yeah, I think the system as a whole definitely appears to be set up to cater to objectors rather to engage the voices of people who actually need homes. And I think a really good example of that is that before I started with Shared Voice and Just Build Homes, I had absolutely no idea why I would ever get involved in the planning process, let alone how. The only exposure that I had ever had to new development in my local area was on my local Facebook page, people saying, how awful is this? This is how you object, and this is what you should say, which to me, someone who's living at home with my dad after university, even made me think, oh gosh, that must be bad. Everyone's saying how awful it is. But when I started with Just Build Homes, I realised that actually they are the only people that are being engaged in the debate, when in reality, I know so many people in my local area that were struggling with housing, stuck at home with living with their parents, and they had no idea about the new developments being proposed or how they could support it. And people who need housing don't have time to engage in the traditional way, like consultations at 2 p.m. in a village hall on a Monday. The people who need homes are usually at work or they've got children to look after. And planning portals themselves are very confusing. You have to trawl through hundreds of documents to find out how many houses there are or how many affordable houses there are. And even so, sometimes you have to decode that language because it's written in a way that people not in the industry would not understand. So I think the strength in our approach to be able to change this and engage people is actually stripping it back and talking about things that people actually care about in a simple way, giving them the tools to have their voices heard, and actually simplifying a process that is extremely overcomplicated but doesn't need to be.
Would you say that it is predominantly young people? Is that a fair assumption? Because it's, you know, how it feels. And I guess actually when we're talking about the housing crisis, even what we count as young people now is actually moving. I mean, you've got people in their 30s still living at home with their parents. And I mean, I know in particular, I've got friends and staff who still are struggling to get on the housing ladder. So what do you mean? What do we even define as a young person now? And when we're talking about housing, I mean, I remember like the Labour Housing Group, we had an event for young people, and actually the cut-off point was under 40.
Yeah, I've definitely seen a shift from the time that I've been with Just Build Homes in the last 3 years. Initially, when I was kind of doing digital work, it was aimed at people who were 18 to just under 30, but now you increasingly hear from people who are in their 30s and 40s who are still unable to access housing, or even the older generations who express concern about their children and grandchildren and where they're going to live. But that's definitely something I've noticed more in the last kind of year or so.
Actually, Win, you were just going to add something. Yeah.
Yeah, just on this point. So when we set up Just Build Homes, we looked at the data, and what we saw in opinion polls was that support for house building is much higher amongst younger demographics, sort of people under 35 and renters. But actually, what's quite interesting about the report that we're releasing today on called 6,000 Reasons to Build is actually the majority of people who express support through Just Build Homes are not under 35. Right. They are 35 to 55. And I think the reason for that is that they are the people, I think, who probably feel the most pain points in the housing system. They are the people that are most engaged in the argument. So even though levels of support for house building are lower in that demographic, although there's still an overwhelming support within that age group, what we find is they are the people who are more motivated, I think, to get involved in the planning process. And it's something that we have been tracking through Just Build Homes for quite a while, actually. But it's something I think that some people might find as a surprise. But we're also, as well, finding that there's significant support in older demographics as well, and particularly among people who are concerned about what's going to happen to their children and their grandchildren. And this is coming across really, really strongly in that sort of over 65 demographic. There's real anxiety about how the housing market as a whole is failing. There's systematic problems with the housing market, and people want to see a change.
And I suppose this is the thing, isn't it? If you're in the older demographic, you don't necessarily want your family to move really, really far away. And there's also that whole sort of community element to it as well. And being able to support your children, to have children, being able to provide grandparent support. So it's really, you know, sometimes quite essential for people to stay closer together, which you can't do if your children have to move really far away because of the cost of housing. But also like population growth as a whole, like we've seen the sort of less people having children or people delaying having children. And I think a lot of that is actually a result of the housing crisis. It's that, as you're saying, Win, those sort of pinch points, that crunch point where you think you might want to settle down, and then you're also sort of thinking, tallying up the costs of your rent or mortgage with the cost of childcare, and actually that sort of ability to settle down and start a family actually feels actually quite distant to you. And I think a lot of people are actually delaying that. Is that something that you've found?
Yeah, I think delayed adulthood is a massive thing that is being spoken about more and more. If you don't have access to housing, you feel that you perhaps can't start a family when you thought you were going to, and you can't access the career options that you thought you'd be able to because you can't live anywhere near London. That's definitely something that I recognise within my friends. I'm 28, and when I was probably 15, I thought I'd be married with children and a house by 26, and that is increasingly further away.
And actually, that's what I actually found quite terrifying in the last election, was that shift in rhetoric on that. Rather than accepting, maybe the people more on the right, that they'd like presided over policies that have created delayed adulthood, childcare, housing, cost of living. But actually, there was a sort of blame culture, particularly on women of my age, that the population is decreasing because we're not doing what we should be. And I started to feel actually quite uncomfortable about that. And I think it goes back to what you were saying earlier, like housing can change, access to good quality housing can actually change so many things for everybody's lives in terms of education, being able to access work, having time to actually think about the future. Because I think there's another thing that I was thinking, that are we getting less entrepreneurialism because of the housing crisis? If you've got a little bit more of a sort of buffer and you're not spending so much of your income on housing, then maybe you might, if you've got a really, really good idea, you might think, oh, okay, maybe I'll go down to 4 days a week or even 3 days a week and start to progress that idea. So I think it actually sort of keeps, it's stifling the economy in so many ways. And I definitely think that we are actually getting less entrepreneurs as a result. So looking at the report, I mean, you've mentioned a few things already, but what do you think are the key findings that surprised you the most?
Well, just to explain what we've done is we've looked at the 6,342 people that have used Just Build Homes to register support on planning portals up and down the country. And I think what makes this report really powerful is that it uses real words from real people. It doesn't rely on survey answers or our guesses. It doesn't assume what people care about. It looks at the data itself. And I think where it leads to is it helps developers and planners understand how people think and feel about these issues. And from that, we will be able to communicate better. So some of the things that we've already touched on, we look at the sort of demographic information on who are these people, both in terms of age groups. We also look at how they differ in different areas. So the people that support housing in urban areas are different from the people that support housing in suburban or rural areas. But we've also identified sort of what we call motivational clusters. And these cut across all age groups and they cut across all areas. And we've identified five of them, and they relate to hardship and the moral arguments for building homes, the systematic crisis we have in our housing market at the moment, the sort of long-term under-delivery, the policy failure, the urgency of tackling that problem. There is a whole discussion about the linkage between building homes and community infrastructure. There's we've picked up a lot of commentary on downsizing and pressure relief, which is perhaps slightly surprising. And then the sort of final sort of motivational cluster is the first time buyer, generational fairness arguments as well that people sort of pick on. So this is based on people's real voices, real comments, and what they're saying. And I think it's...
So these are the sorts of motivations for them to want to be pro seeing housing, seeing building happening in their area.
And to motivate them to get involved, because they've got to take an action, which is they've got to respond to a planning consultation, and you've got to be pretty motivated to do that. And obviously, objectors by their very nature are motivated because they want to stop something from happening. So to try to motivate people to say this is a good thing, that normally is much harder. But these are the arguments that people are using themselves when they go onto planning portals to say we support these schemes. So we think that in terms of how we as an industry start developing our narrative, we need to start sort of looking at some of these arguments and developing a narrative that responds basically to what these people are saying.
Because I suppose that's the thing, isn't it? Like, if you've got really, really strong objectors, actually, some of these arguments that you've got from your pro-planning application people, who has, those sort of other motivations, could they be in a way almost used to maybe change the minds of some of those objectors? Because sometimes it's that actually, when you really, really get under the hood, and we find this with community consultation, is there are many, many reasons why people might be objecting. Some of them are just like, I don't want any more people in my area and I don't want to see anything at all. But sometimes if you can actually really, really get under the skin of that, you can see there's multiple reasons, and actually sometimes they may be able to be swayed with those more emotive motivations from your pro planning application people, and they could actually be swayed. Because I mean, the hardship argument is a really, really good one, because it's that sort of a really key motivation that even someone who's objecting to a planning application can kind of understand, and it can really, really tap into the emotions of the objectors, because everything's emotional, isn't it? I mean, I recently have interviewed a chap on the podcast, which will be out. Actually, it's out very, very soon, and he does a lot of campaigning. And he's saying, we can have access to the information. We all know what we should be doing, and we have the information, but nobody feels it. And actually, the thing that sways people is emotion. And I think even with the objectors, they probably do know that we need to see more homes being built. They know we have a housing crisis. We talk about it everywhere, and they can see their children and grandchildren can't access a home, but they don't feel it, because to them emotionally, they have this idea that that having new homes built in their area is going to affect them negatively, and emotionally, your pro planning application people. I mean, what's the best word to call them? We need a better word. YIMBYs, yes, the YIMBYs. They're also, what's motivating them is very, very emotional. It's, I'm feeling left out. I'm experiencing hardship. I can't, my children can't get on the housing ladder. I can't start a family. All of those things, they tap into the emotion a little bit. And I suppose that's where these two things can actually sort of come together, actually finding those sort of shared challenges and shared feelings and shared emotion. And maybe that is actually going to be much more successful than just what the politicians have been saying the whole time, which is we just need to meet these numbers. And, there's nothing emotional about that. Do you see that?
I think a really good example of that is that where I live in a really rural, leafy village, there is so much objection about new homes. But if you were to go into the local pub and say, do you know someone affected by the housing crisis?
Yeah.
Everyone does.
Yeah.
Everyone knows someone that has struggled with housing in the local community in some form. And when you ignite those conversations and start talking about real people in local areas, that's when the narrative kind of shifts. But I do think that we just need to do more as an industry in general to present housing as what it is, a public good.
Yes.
Homes help people. There is sometimes an apprehension to talk about the benefits of actually building homes, and that's how the narrative needs to shift. Housing is good because it gives people somewhere to live, and that's the really simple top line message.
Also, using the term homes is actually much more emotive as well, isn't it? Homes are for the people that you know, for people in general, rather than just units, which are just being buildings that are just going up in your area and there's sort of no human link to it. So on that point then, as I'm an architect, as you know, and our industry, like developers, maybe we are actually not doing the best in terms of the language that we're using, and actually sort of bringing that emotional and using the sort of correct words and language that can actually sort of tap into the emotion, as we've been talking about, and those key messages. So I guess, what would you say to the industry, so to architects like myself, developers, planners, what can we actually take from the report that might help us be more successful with our planning applications?
Yeah, I think the top line message is just that we need to start talking about what people in need of homes thinks is important, not just what the industry thinks is important. I think a lot of the time there's a really big push on going out and saying, oh, I'm really sorry, but we're going to reduce the height, and we're going to build less homes, and just things that actually, if you're in need of a new home, what you care about is availability and affordability. They're the key messages that we need to start communicating. And if you start talking about things like schools staying open, shops being able to thrive, families staying together, these are the messages that will resonate. And if you have trusted local people going out in the community and saying, actually, if we don't build more homes, we're going to lose our local shop and my children won't be able to stay living near me, the perception and the narrative will begin to change, because the housing crisis has been humanised. And I think it's that storytelling that is sometimes missing from traditional communications, both with the community and with decision makers, because when you humanize the housing crisis and start telling these stories and engaging these supportive demographics, they're not just numbers on housing waiting lists. They're real people that need housing.
Yeah, and something that real people can resonate with. And actually, that is the interesting thing, I think, in reading the report. It really, really does bring that sort of human element home, and you can actually really, really resonate to that, like hearing all of those quotes. And maybe, as you're mentioning the report, it would be good to hear a little bit more about the three clusters that you mentioned, the three sort of different area types.
Yeah, certainly. So if you look at the supporters that come from urban areas, what we tend to see is their comments are more sort of reflected in their sort of experience, their lived experience, and they'll be talking about, waiting for council housing, unaffordable rents, watching those sort of issues that are overcrowded housing. Those are sort of the themes: growth, the regeneration benefits. When you move on to sort of suburban areas, we see a slightly different story, and it's about sort of keeping our communities intact, and it's about people feeling that they may be unable to afford to stay in this area, in the area that they're grown up in, and sort of leave. So the tone sort of those comments are slightly different. And then when you move into rural areas, obviously affordability sort of is an issue across all three groups, but they see in many ways they see housing as a way to preserve the community they have. It's about, if we want to keep the post office open, we need people here. If we want the local school to remain open, we need families to move into the area. And at the moment, it's really interesting that in rural areas, the motivation is about preserving and sustaining our way of life, and that's the benefit of house building. Whereas I think in urban areas, it's seen much more in terms of growth, regeneration, tackling a much more urban, a much more urgent problem in terms of overcrowding, homelessness, and those types of issues.
I think actually, like, particularly the rural arguments, I found really, really interesting, because that's actually really that the argument of like preserving the community as a sort of pro-planning application point is really, really used. You actually quite often get that on the objector side, where seeing new homes being built in their area, they feel that's a sort of challenge to their community. But actually the argument that's made to say more people coming to this village is actually going to preserve the village itself and actually sort of keep it going. I mean, I mentioned my nan a lot in this podcast. She lives in a small village just outside Chichester, and when I was small, we had 4 shops that she could, walk about, buy a pint of milk, buy a paper, have a sort of interaction with somebody. And since then, all of the shops have closed. They've all turned into homes, and now that sort of actually has a massive effect on her independence. And also, because the village is sort of shrinking, the bus route, and less people using the bus route is not as regular. So for her, if she misses one, she has to wait a really, really long time to the next one. So even her ability to get to Chichester, like the sort of closest, biggest town, she doesn't do that anymore either. So it's actually reduced her independence, and she's much more reliant on my mum. But actually, if there was a shop and a regular bus route, she probably would do more things for herself. And I think that's why that's really, really important, to actually keep these communities going and have more homes there. And we really need to start making that argument that if you want this village to exist, it can't just become a museum piece where people come for their Airbnbs in the summer, basically. We actually do need to see more homes built here too.
Well, I think it's it picks up on what Millie was saying earlier, in the sense that, if you go to a website, a planning website from a developer, or you go to a public exhibition, or you go to a presentation from developers, none of these issues have been talked about. They will talk about why this site has been allocated in a local plan. They will talk about the justification for why it is a taller building, because that they will use it's in line with the local vernacular. They will talk about car parking units and spaces and policies. And what's really interesting, of the 6,384 people, not one of them mentioned any of those issues. What they're talking about are real people, these types of issues, and none of that is incorporated into the narrative that developers make in support of housing and development. And I think the rural one is really interesting because we at Shared Voice have really struggled to talk about community and infrastructure. And there is definitely a linkage between house building and infrastructure. So, for example, there was a survey that was released a few months ago, which asked the question, would you support house building if it was supported by strong infrastructure? And I think the levels of support were 80% plus. There were huge numbers of people. So from a developer perspective, a developer says, well, we're delivering 1,000 homes, but we're also delivering a local school. So let's talk about the local school. We're delivering infrastructure. But we know from when we've done focus groups is that if we sort of tell 8 people in a focus group, the developer will also be providing a new school. The response is, oh yeah, sure, we've heard that before. It'll never happen. And then you say, no, it will happen. It's going to be part of a Section 106. It's part of a legal agreement. And they just simply don't accept it. They just say, well, we've heard those promises before. It never happens. And the more that you dig in, and we've done this in focus group after focus group, even with supportive audiences, they react by saying, well, if you're lying about that, what else are you lying about? And what's quite interesting in our research in this report is that I don't think anyone is talking about, I support this development because they're providing a new school. I'm supporting this development because they're providing new GP surgeries. However, they are talking about, I support this development or this housing because it will help preserve and sustain existing public services. And all of a sudden, we as an industry have a narrative that is believable out in the wider world, that has support, that people can trust, and is really powerful.
Yeah.
I do think that there should be a piece around communicating around Section 106 because before I was involved in the industry, I would have no idea what things in my local community has been paid for by housing. And if there was just this really simple way that local councils could communicate with the community about all of the really great things that have been paid for with housing, I think that would really improve the general narrative around new development.
Yeah, and a sort of a wake up in a way as well. Like this development will help this, and actually by that happening can actually help build trust as well. And actually, I think also the voices in your report can actually having those sort of pro voices and actually quite a large quantum of them, and showing that more people support housing than don't, can be really important for the sort of political sphere as well. Because you do find, particularly when developments are, when it's sort of the year of local elections or even a general election, as we know, the objectors quite often are the loudest voice. And then, a sort of local politician will sort of start to panic in a way. They think, well, I can't speak in favour of this development because all of my voters are against it. When actually, that's not the case, as we can see in the report. It's just a small percentage that are able to make a lot of noise against the planning application. But by creating the counter narrative that you've done, you can actually allow them to utilise those voices, use those sort of human arguments, those emotive arguments, as to say why something should happen. I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah, I've been speaking at planning committees recently. So when we work on a project, when we've engaged local voices in support of a planning application, I will go along to committee and use the 3 minutes to really emphasise and share those stories, because it's quite a big ask to ask someone from the community to go into that forum, because it's not always the friendliest. It's sometimes a bit of a tense atmosphere. But from that activity, we have had over 800 homes approved in the last few months. But most importantly,
great.
I've had some really great conversations with committee members who have thanked me for making their job easier to communicate with their local community about the benefits of housing, because they are now armed with the voices of 50 people in their local community that have shared their lived experiences and why they actually think that development is a positive thing to go ahead.
And also, I suppose, by providing the language of support and the sort of means and the tools to actually register and actually make your voice heard, I mean, that's actually quite strong what you've managed to do, because the whole process is quite intimidating, and the sort of everyday person who's actually got the time to even think about how you do that, how you access planning portal, where do you go, what kind of words do you use, how do you write a letter to to be in support of an application. I mean, most people, everyday normal people, have got a lot going on, and actually, if you're waiting on the housing waiting list, you've probably got even more going on and less time available, and you're probably quite busy. Because that's the other challenge, isn't it? Like, who's actually got the time to like turn up to a planning committee at 8 p.m. when you've got 3 kids at home?
Yeah, and then sit there for 4 hours. They're not usually just one.
Yeah, exactly. And if it's an online event, not everyone has access to the digital services. So as part of the report, you've put together a 5-point plan. Would you like to take us through it?
Yeah, so we see really the 5-point plan as a sort of roadmap really for developers to develop a narrative and a language and a strategy for engaging supportive audiences. Because I think what the industry has done to date is that there's a small group of people over here, like the councillors and the parish council and the residents association, who in the main are opposed to development. And their narrative has been, you're wrong, we're right, and trying to come up with justifications for that. But there's a huge group of people over here who are open to support development, but none of the narrative is aimed at these people. So quite often we'll get developers saying, but we've sent out 20,000 leaflets. We've had 100,000 Facebook impressions. We've had, so loads of people have seen our content. But the problem is, if the narrative and the language is about sites being allocated in local plans and the design strategy and parking, it's not going to resonate at all. So what our 5-point toolkit does is it starts talking about the audiences that you can engage and how different messages resonate with different audiences. It talks about the sort of tone that you can use with different audiences. I think one thing that's really, really important and that we're doing now more of is bringing real voices into the communications activity. In fact, the first thing I would do if I was advising a developer, the first thing I would advise them now is if they had a new site and they were bringing it forward, before doing any communications, before you do any sort of scoping out of who are the key stakeholder audiences, I would find a handful of people who live locally who have got an interest in seeing that development go ahead. So that might be, 28-year-old Louis. He lives with his girlfriend. They live at his parents. They, would love to find a place of their own, but they can't because everything's too expensive. They probably will have to move out of their area. All their friends live in their area. Their family live there. They would like to stay there, but they will probably have to move out because there's nowhere affordable locally. Find, 35-year-old Abigail, got 2 kids, live in a 1-bedroom house, have been on a housing waiting list for the last 5 years, and get their stories. Find, 67-year-old Barbara who's worried about her kids and her grandchildren. And let's start the story there with their stories, their words, even record them by film. And when you're going to see planning officers and when you're running exhibitions or you've got content on websites, let's start with their stories. Yeah. And ultimately, what we're doing in terms of building homes is we are providing a solution for those people. So effectively what our 5-point plan does, it looks at, relatable outcomes that the development will deliver from a public perspective. And we hope that the industry will look at it and embrace it.
Yeah, I mean, these all sound like really, really good ideas, actually. I think that, and this is the thing, isn't it? We make it clear, this is what is needed and this is how we achieve it. And I mean, I know Chris Young, who I interviewed in the last episode, but he made that really, really good point that you wouldn't be able to say if somebody had access to medical treatment or not, but we're able to say whether somebody has access to a new home or not. So actually, when you sort of like turn that around with the sort of arguments and motivations that are sort of made clear in the report, it's really, really clear why it's needed. And actually, those sort of voices are really, really powerful. And you'd have to be like really, really cold-hearted to disagree, right? Moving on slightly. So, I don't know how you're feeling. I'm feeling much more optimistic in terms of housing. We've got a new government that's committed to building homes. Does it feel like a shift? Are you optimistic? Is it happening fast enough?
I'm relatively optimistic. I think we've seen a massive shift in the last sort of 9-10 months.
Mm-hmm.
Schemes that we might have been working on 3-4 years ago are finally coming to committee, and they were literally stuck in planning hell for a very long time. And what we're finding is the work that we're doing in terms of finding supportive audiences is almost like complementing where the government is coming from, because councils now know they need to approve homes. So if you're looking, if schemes are coming forward, you know that you've got to approve some of them. If there's a scheme here that's got 50 people who are backing it, well, it's easier if you're a councillor to support that scheme than one that's got just lots of opposition to it. So we've definitely seen a significant shift, and hopefully we will see that grow over the coming years.
Millie, are you optimistic?
I mean, I've got a lot shorter experience in this industry, but I think it is a lot more positive, and we've had loads of approvals recently, which has been fantastic. And I've noticed as well in the planning committees that I've been in, there has been more of a positive conversation and more of a willingness to accept that actually we do need to build homes, and we have evidence to support that this is needed in the local community. So yeah, I would say I am optimistic.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I guess there's probably is still stuff that can be improved. So you've got your 5-point plan, which is laid out in the report. What would you say is maybe like a really, really quick win that the government could do to sort of improve the planning system? What could they do straight away?
I've got a few actually. My focus is on leveling the playing field in access to planning.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Think there is a lot of work that can be done on planning portals. Just a personal anecdote. I once supported a scheme in my local area, and I checked the planning portal afterwards, and they'd put it up as an objection.
Oh my
And
word.
I phoned and to check. I thought it was a clerical error, and actually they told me that they don't often get letters of support, and they've got nowhere to house them. And if that wasn't the case, if you're a journalist and you went on a planning portal and you just saw 100 objections and there's no way of actually viewing the letter, which is the case on some planning portals, it just absolutely deepens the narrative that housing is unpopular, when in fact that's not necessarily the case. And there are lots of other planning portals where you can object or not object, or just there isn't always an option to support. I think small changes like that could really help the perception of house building and accessibility. And I've encountered some rules with committee meetings sometimes that you can't register to speak in support unless there are a certain number of people who are registered to speak in objection.
Madness.
And that sounds bizarre when you say it, but if you change that, it might not mean that there are loads of other people queuing up to speak at committee, because we all know that is a difficult ask, but it shouldn't be the case that objectors and supporters have different rules around them. It should be an equal playing field.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds actually completely mad. I didn't even know that, to be honest. If a scheme only has support, why not just let those people speak? And actually, as you're saying, that sounds like something that can happen that doesn't even necessarily require legislation. That is actually quite a quick thing that can change. And actually, maybe if we do have more people if you have schemes that only have support, then it also sort of generates that more positive feeling about house building in general. So what do you think maybe the longer term asks would be?
Well, I suppose just purely looking at consultation, and I think the government is making some sort of positive steps here. It's made some changes recently made some announcements on changing the consultation around the national strategic infrastructure projects, and making them sort of more interesting, and reducing the sort of statutory requirements. But I think what we find in the way that the planning system operates is a very, very small number of people have a significant impact. So sometimes you will have a planning application that comes to committee. It might have 30 objections, and councillors will say, well, everyone's against this, we will vote against it. And it doesn't matter where you are. If you've got 30 people, that's a tiny number of people. So I think what council should be doing, what government should be doing, it should be looking far more at proper opinion research techniques to understand what public opinion is, both in terms of surveys with representative samples and also sort of focus groups. And I think if you introduced more of those sort of techniques into our system, what you would find is that actually public opinion is completely different from the 30 people that submit a response to a planning application. And I think it's more important that we focus on those sort of views rather than a very, very small number of views. The whole planning system has been captured by a tiny minority of people. And we need to change that. We need to ensure that it actually represents everyone. And at the moment, it doesn't.
I mean, yeah, that makes actually so much sense. I mean, like you say, it's basically a numbers game and it's all about representation and it's about a realistic approach to the numbers. I mean, if you've got 30 people objecting, there's probably a hell of a lot more people in that same area who actually are probably more in housing need that would like to see those homes built, but they're just got better things to do and actually way too busy to sort of show in support. And it's, I suppose it is about like representation. So where would you like us all to be in 5 years' time, as an industry, as a country, and the planning system?
I would just like to be in a place where support for house building is assumed and that it's a natural and expected part of the planning process where decision makers actually ask applicants to engage supportive audiences, to actively go out and speak to them rather than just kind of ignoring them. And maybe if a couple of people support, that's good enough. But then there should be an expectation to involve the voices of people in need of housing in the planning process.
Yeah, I would echo Millie there, really. I think it's, if you think about where we are at the moment, development is seen in the main as a bad. And we say, I know this is bad, but in mitigation, and we actually use that word, in mitigation, we are putting money into local education services. In mitigation, we are putting money into health services. In mitigation, we're improving biodiversity, or we have a social value plan. But the reality is, providing housing in itself is a public good. And where we should be is changing, and I think this is for the industry to do, not for government. This is for our industry to do, is we need to change the narrative around our industry so we are seen as part of the solution in delivering that public good. And that when it comes to, we've got a planning application here to build 200 homes, people go, well, that's fantastic. That's great. That's exactly what we want, because it is a public good. We have, last night, 160,000 children were living in temporary accommodation. The only way we're going to tackle that problem is if we build more homes. We as an industry are part of that solution, and we need to be, we need a narrative that gets that message out there. So it just seems a no-brainer to support development and house building because it is seen as a positive.
Yeah. I mean, that's so true. I mean, actually, on the point of temporary accommodation, it takes such a long time to build buildings, and children are not children for very long. So 5-10 years, every year that we delay solving this problem, that's somebody's childhood basically being wiped out by being in temporary accommodation. Which, I mean, 160,000 children, that should just be enough to really, really get going faster and sort of make it clear that homes are for the public good. And also, I think when we were thinking about language, I mean, using the example of heritage, the term that is quite often used, I mean, I was talking to a planning consultant the other day, and the term that's often used is harm. So there's already that rhetoric that building a new building could potentially cause harm, particularly in terms of heritage. And then, I mean, I love heritage buildings. I enjoy conservation areas, but I do think we do need to also sort of understand where does the sort of heritage end and modern world begin, and also be able to make our own heritage. If it's good architecture, then that is the heritage of the future as well. And I think this sort of whole language around potentially new buildings causing harm also sort of feeds into that sort of objective argument as well. But anyway, I think everything that we've said today, there's definitely quite a few things that I'm going to take away from our conversation that I think can sort of help and improve in the language that we use in our day-to-day work. And I think there's a lot that developers could take away as well. I mean, maybe one bonus question. If you had Angela Rayner right here, right now, what would be the one thing you would say to her? Maybe just one sentence. And I know it's a mean question because I didn't tell you I was going to ask.
Okay, I'll go first. I would say to Angela, read our report And this is the way that both government, politicians, and the industry can talk about house building. And the reason for that is this is what people themselves are saying. Let's appropriate their language about why housing is needed, and it will be far more aligned to what the public are saying than anything a PR consultant could come up with.
And I would probably add to her if she's at UK Reef to come to our event on the 20th.
Yes. She did go last year, didn't she? And I suppose that's the other thing, maybe to sort of make it clear to everyone listening that we will be on a panel together. What is it, 10 a.m? No, 9 a.m? Better make sure
an early start.
At UK Reef on the Tuesday morning, 9 a.m. And yeah, I think in summary, maybe for the conversation today, I think everything you're both saying, it makes it clear that there's a lot we can all get out of the report. And I think maybe in summary, we just say we need to listen to the people and then we can all build some more homes.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's been a really great conversation.
Thanks, Jen.